So good afternoon and welcome to concurrent paper session 3A. We are grateful to our two presenters, Danny and Vincent, and as well as to our featured respondent, Dr. Dan McKanan. By way of introduction, Dr. McKanan serves as the Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Senior Lecturer at Harvard Divinity School, where he's taught since 2008. He studies religious and spiritual movements for social transformation in the United States and beyond, with particular emphasis on environmental activism, intentional communities, and socialism. Much of his research focuses on the Unitarian Universalist tradition and the anthroposophical movement. He's the author of 6 books, among them Camp Hill and the Future, Spirituality and Disability in an Evolving Communal Movement, Eco-Alchemy, Anthroposophy and the History and Future of Environmentalism, and Prophetic Encounters, Religion and American Radical Tradition, which won the Frederick G. Melcher Book Award. As Emerson Senior Lecturer, Professor McKanan is deeply involved in the formation of Unitarian Universalist ministers and professional leaders at the Divinity School and of Unitarian Universalist scholars at Harvard and across the US. At Harvard, he's chaired the MTS Curriculum Committee for many years and chaired the American Studies program in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences from 2019 to just last year, 2021. So welcome, Dr. McKanan. So before we begin, I'll kind of give a quick format overview. Each presenter will have 15 to 20 minutes. I will send a quick message via the chat when you've hit the 15-minute mark to let you know you have 5 minutes left. After the presentations, Dr. McKanan will offer his response, which can range from 20 to 30 minutes, whatever remaining time we have. And then we can open the floor to just a more organic conversation, any questions that might arise, some crosstalk, whatever you'd like. So we'll begin today with Danny Ballon-Garst. Danny is a second-year PhD student in the Graduate Division of Religion at Emory University, the American Religious Cultures track. His research interests include American religious history, race, religion, and sexuality, and religion and politics. Danny is currently developing his dissertation project on the religious history of the 20th century gay rights movement in the United States. Today, he will be offering a presentation entitled Ambiguous Affirmations, Querying Black Religious Responses to the AIDS Crisis. So Danny, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Zach. And it's good to be here with you all and to be in virtual conversation. Kind of one of the benefits of Zoom is we get to kind of be in the same place even when we're not. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Professor McKanan, it was a professor of mine at HDS, and I was excited to see your name as a respondent and to get to be in conversation with you about my work. So I'll start by sharing my screen. Actually, Zach, I'll need permission to do that. And I have some slides to go along with my presentation. So the title of my presentation, as Zach said, is Ambiguous Affirmations, Querying Black Religious Responses to the AIDS Crisis. Picture this. The date is October 6, 1989, a day of coordinated ACT-UP protests taking place in the United States and cities across the United States. 500 protesters peaceably assemble in San Francisco's Civic Center to stage a rally protesting the city's response or lack of response to the AIDS crisis, with the plan to then march to the predominantly gay Castro district only 2 miles away. The protesters are met by 200 police officers, dressed in tactical gear, half of all officers on duty that day, who for 3 hours brutalized the protesters, arresting 60, injuring 10, in one of the city's worst recorded instances of mass police violence, remembered as a Castro sweep. The protesters demonstrated incredible bravery that night and the next, when 200 activists gathered to hold a candlelight vigil to protest the violence of the night before. But I want to focus my presentation not on the October 6 ACT-UP protest, but on something that happened 6 months earlier, just across the San Francisco Bay in Berkeley, California. And so here I have a video clip that I'll show you, and then I'll come back and tell you what it is that we're watching.
We have one last word we'd like to leave with you. It's a hymn writer that said, "Be not dismayed."
So this was the evening of May 28th, 1989, at the height of the AIDS crisis. What you're seeing here is Grammy Award-winning gospel artist Reverend Walter Hawkins and the Love Center Choir joining with other San Francisco Bay Area gospel performers for the In Concert Against AIDS benefit, a benefit to raise money for local HIV/AIDS service providers serving predominantly low-income African-American communities in San Francisco's East Bay, Oakland area. In a moment when most Black churches were silent at best about HIV's impact in Black communities, or at worst hostile to gays and lesbians, Hawkins and Love Center's participation at the benefit was significant. In the audience that night were people with AIDS and people providing services to those afflicted by the disease. Presumably, at least some of these people were gay, lesbian, queer, or same-gender loving. The choir's powerful and energetic performances centered around the theme, Jesus will make a way, and God will take care of you, as we just heard. Making Love Center one of a handful of Black churches in this era, in fact, one of a handful of churches of any race for that matter, to publicly display a posture of compassion towards people living with what by then had been identified in the public imagination as a gay disease. Yet viewed in its broader historical context, this moment is fraught. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Love Center Church, a predominantly African-American church rooted in the Black Pentecostal tradition, had developed a reputation for being welcoming to gays and lesbians, and for providing one of the sole sources of pastoral and spiritual care for people living with AIDS in the Oakland community. Yet Love Center's theology of sexuality was always ambiguous. Neither Reverend Hawkins nor church leadership ever publicly embraced or celebrated same-gender loving individuals or unions, even though many of the church's members and even its associate pastor, Reverend Yvette Flunder, were themselves same-gender loving. A dynamic now Bishop Flunder recounted in a recent oral history interview as a version of Don't Ask, Don't Tell light. How then do we make sense of Love Center's performance this night at the benefit, and in particular of the participation of its queer members and even of the queer people in the audience? Situated against the backdrop of the discourses of sexual liberation, prevalent in queer political imaginaries then and today, with center outness, visibility, demands for full acceptance, and public political confrontation, more akin to that present in the example of the ACT UP protest I started this presentation with, it might be tempting to view this moment as an instance of social accommodation, as an inadequate and insufficient response to the challenge of the moment. But I want to argue for a different interpretation. Along the themes of the conference, I argue that the Pentecostal charismatic worship experience we observe at this benefit is a form of religious activism, or at least a form of pre-activism, the kind of work necessary to set the foundation and cultivate the emotional and spiritual conditions for more recognizable or familiar forms of activism, or at the very least, the kind of work necessary to cultivate hope and sustain a community in its moment of God-forsakenness. I'll argue this by attending to the forms of agency embodied, performed, and practiced in Love Center's performance, and by situating this performance in its historical and cultural context. In doing so, I hope to render visible the rhetorical, discursive, and performative strategies of queer self-affirmation and communal empowerment that challenge us to rethink or queer the boundaries of what we consider religious activism, and to consider seriously the spiritual practices that are a necessary part of and undergird social change. So let me start by laying out the conceptual and theoretical framework that are shaping my thinking here. My reading of Love Center's performance is shaped by three distinct but overlapping theoretical and conceptual frameworks: feminist theory, queer of color critique, and moral agency under constraint. First, the notion of agency that informs my analysis is largely inspired by Saba Mahmood's interventions around agency and the feminist subject, described in Politics of Piety, in which Mahmood argued for an uncoupling of the notion of agency from the politically prescriptive projects of feminism. Mahmood argued that the failure to unlink our notions of agency from a progressive feminist agenda resulted in the propensity in feminist scholarship to, quote, valorize those operations of power that subvert and resignify the hegemonic discourses of gender and sexuality. The upshot of this propensity, Mahmoud noted, is a tendency to emphasize politically subversive forms of agency while ignoring other modalities, quote, whose meaning and effect are not captured within the logic of subversion and resignification. I extend this observation to analyses of the agency of religiously conservative queer subjects, whose lives and actions often fall outside the bounds of the liberal gay and lesbian political imaginary. Second, my analysis is informed by queer of color critique. As described by Roderick Ferguson and E. Patrick Johnson, queer of color critique emerged in the early 2000s as a challenge to a founding limitation of queer studies, namely queer studies' initial ambivalence about analyzing connections between sexuality and other modes of difference like race and class. Scholars working in this vein argue that the deconstructive turn in early queer theory, with its insistence on deconstructing and destabilizing all forms of fixed stable categories and identities, failed to address the material realities of gays and lesbians of color, for whom social identities like race and gender are not, quote, essentialisms, but rather, given the realities of racism, often a strategic choice, such that queer theory's calls for the elimination of fixed categories seems to ignore the ways in which some traditional social identities and communal ties can in fact be important to one's survival. Historiographically, these scholars noted how queer studies assumed queer sexuality to develop in a narrative of progress, captured in the notion of coming out. They noted that one problem with this framing is that it often renders illegible the subjectivities of non-white or non-Western queers, whose experiences of sexuality are not consistent with that narrative, coding as unliberated or homophobic practices that do not conform with Western narratives of this developmental sexuality. Finally, my thinking here is shaped by moral agency under constraint, which describes a kind of condition for human action, and which is the name of a doctoral seminar taught at Emory by Dr. Alan Ott Marshall, which I took in the fall of 2021. The premise of the class is to build on the work of Christian ethicist Katie Geneva Cannon, and in particular, Cannon's differentiation between ethics of life under oppression and established approaches that take for granted freedom and a wide range of choices. Marshall argues that Cannon, quote, refused to allow a moral theory that assumes freedom and choice to evaluate the life of someone who has neither, not only because these more established approaches within the Western philosophical tradition render immoral or amoral the values and practices of a life lived under oppression, but because they fail to comprehend and appreciate the moral wisdom that is present and active in a life lived under constraint. Indebted to these insights, my approach in this paper takes seriously the historical and cultural context in which my subjects are embedded, not only to describe or explain, let alone justify their actions, but to attend to the wisdom inherent in the ways they creatively navigate the webs of power in which they are embedded in order to carve out for themselves and for others space that enables survival, connection, and flourishing in an unjust world. So now to talk about the context. Religious historian Lynn Gerber describes the year 1989 as a moment in which gays and lesbians and AIDS activists in Northern California found themselves caught in a number of political crosswinds. Legislatively, this year would witness a voter referendum spearheaded by the Catholic Church to overturn domestic partnership legislation passed in San Francisco, as well as a referendum in the nearby city of Concord, this one led by conservative evangelicals, to nullify the city's anti-discrimination law. The political moment was tense, not least of which was because of the urgency created by the HIV/AIDS crisis and the government's inexcusably tepid response. By 1989, over 117,000 people had been diagnosed with HIV in the United States alone, and over 89,000 of those people had died. Moreover, the first of the protease inhibiting drugs, AZT, approved by the FDA for the treatment of HIV in 1987, had by 1989 shown only limited success, merely delaying an inevitable death and often causing side effects as bad or worse than the effects of the disease, and in any case was exorbitantly priced and out of reach for the vast majority of patients. All of this would have been painfully clear to the people in California's San Francisco Bay Area, which had one of the highest per capita rates of HIV in the United States. But these realities would have been felt all that much more in African American communities, such as those in the East Bay region and Oakland, which were grossly overrepresented in the rates of new HIV cases, yet predictably underserved by the delivery of healthcare services, which skewed along racial and geographic lines. Compounding these problems was the fact that the scarce resources that were available for HIV/AIDS education, testing, and treatment tended to be concentrated in gay urban enclaves, like San Francisco's Castro district, urban spaces which themselves were often overlain with 20th century histories of racial discrimination and gentrification that marked these enclaves as spaces designed primarily for affluent and middle-class white men. In practical terms, what this meant was that African Americans in the East Bay seeking testing for HIV or medical care after receiving a positive diagnosis often had to commute across the San Francisco Bay to San Francisco's gay neighborhoods to receive care they needed, risking outing themselves in the process or raising questions about their sexuality, or at the very least, opening themselves up to the experience of marginalization that comes from inhabiting a space where the color of a person's skin and class presentation can easily mark them as an outsider. Noticeably absent from the debates about the government response to HIV in Black communities were Black churches and Black religious leaders, an absence made notable by the historic role Black churches have played in advocating for the needs of Black communities and in creating and providing robust communities of care for Black people suffering the effects of various forms of marginalization. This relative absence or silence can best be understood against the backdrop of the politics of respectability that shaped and constrained Black religious responses to debates over gender equity and sexuality throughout the 20th century, especially in regards to homosexuality. The politics of respectability dominated Black political praxis throughout the mid-20th century civil rights movement, but among other forces, it also inflected Black receptivity to gay rights in the late 20th century, including Black responses to the AIDS crisis. It is here that Love Center, despite not publicly affirming queerness, including the queerness of its HIV-affected members, filled a void. Love Center Church was founded by Walter Hawkins, pictured here, in the mid-1970s as a storefront church in the East Bay city of Oakland, California. Hawkins, an ordained minister in the Pentecostal Church of God in Christ, came to fame in the late 1960s producing and performing gospel music with the Edwin Hawkins Singers, a renowned gospel group led by older brother Edwin, who attained international fame with his 1969 chart-crossing hit, Oh Happy Day. In time, Walter branched out and developed his own distinctive gospel sound, releasing numerous critically acclaimed albums, including the Love Alive series, as well as his 1981 album, The Lord's Prayer, for which Walter won a Grammy for Best Gospel Performance. According to historian Claudrina Harold, while the Hawkins had grown up in a devoutly Pentecostal home, his upbringing had lacked the rigidity typically associated with Pentecostal parents, and it showed in Love Center's approach to social ministry. While Love Center incorporated many traditional aspects of the Pentecostal worship experience and theology, the church was an eclectic mix of Christians seeking relationship with God, fellowship, and a sense of belonging. Evincing a spirit of inclusivity not typical of more socially conservative and traditional Pentecostal churches, Love Center promoted a doctrine it called eternal security, the idea that salvation is not fragile, but permanent, and as such cannot be lost. While Love Center and its leadership never fully affirmed or celebrated its queer members and couples publicly, Reverend Hawkins' message about AIDS was always clear. AIDS is not God's punishment, he said. Tragedy is not a punishment from God. It was a message Reverend Hawkins preached at dozens of funerals in the heat of the crisis, and for which he faced much criticism from more conservative Black Pentecostal leaders. At this point, the question often comes up: why would Black queer people choose to go to a church that is not fully affirming of them, especially when queer affirming churches are and were available? To understand the answer to this question, it helps to keep in mind one last piece of the social context. Black gays and lesbians in the 1980s and 90s frequently invoked the notion of double jeopardy to describe the dual experience of oppression of being both a racial and a sexual minority. It's important to keep in mind here that coming out as a path to sexual liberation for Black gays and lesbians was not without its consequences. In addition to the rejection and marginalization they faced from Black communities, they also risked encountering various levels of racism from gay and lesbian communities. Despite the more liberal ideas around sexuality, gay-affirming religious spaces were not immune from these very same racist impulses. Indeed, queer clergy of color in the 1970s and 80s frequently commented publicly about the marginalization they experienced within predominantly white gay and lesbian religious institutions like the Metropolitan Community Church, as well as on the constant cloud of suspicion under which they operated when they were granted opportunities to gather and organize separately in affinity groups. Importantly for our purposes, these queer-affirming religious spaces often embodied an unmarked whiteness and cultural exclusiveness, manifest in the religious and theological aesthetics that entrenched themselves as hegemonic in these spaces, which were largely shaped by the liturgical practices, styles of worship, preaching, music, and church governance of ecumenical Protestantism. These religious formations were often at odds with the theological commitments and cultural investments of more conservative gay and lesbian Christians, conservative both theologically and in some cases politically, including queer Christians of color. The upshot being that Black gay and lesbian people of faith often faced a quandary. the prospect of having to give up important theological and cultural commitments in the process of seeking acceptance in predominantly white gay Christian spaces. One commentator wrote, "Almost always it is a ticket into a new kind of freedom with expensive price tags." Okay, so with all this in mind, we can return to my argument and to Love Center's performance. It was centered around the theme of Jesus as a waymaker, a thread that ran through each of the choir's performances, as well as Reverend Flunder and Reverend Hawkins' remarks between songs. There are three forms of agency that ground my argument here, that this performance is a form of religious activism. First, I argue that we should construe as a form of religious activism Love Center's queer members' performance and participation in celebratory gospel music within a Pentecostal charismatic Life Church tradition, even if that church was only ambiguously queer affirming. Given the context and constraints described above, this form of agency allowed Love Center's queer members to navigate and work within the boundaries of constraint to carve out discursive and performative space to affirm their queer selves, even though not in explicit terms, and to lay claim to authoritative ground in the pulpit, on the stage, and in the music ministry that otherwise would not have been available to them had they come out publicly. This form of agency stands in line with the long tradition within African-American Protestantism of people, for example, women, working within the boundaries of constraint to creatively carve out spaces of authority, power, and influence without ever directly challenging the prevailing structures of oppression. And I would refer here to historical work by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham on the work of Black Baptist women, and Anthea Butler to the work of Black women in the Church of God in Christ. But this only scratches the surface. A closer engagement with the particularities of charismatic Black Protestant traditions is needed for the more subtle forms of agency evident in this performance to come to the fore. Here I draw on Jonathan Walton's framework of competing rituals of self-affirmation and social accommodation, which Walton developed in his study of the ethics and aesthetics of Black televangelism. Drawing on Victor Turner's notion of liminality in the ritualization process, liminal referring here metaphorically to the phase of subjective transition from the physical to the metaphysical world, Walton argues that the liminal moment in charismatic worship temporarily suspends issues of race, class, and gender inequality, enabling moments of personal empowerment and, quote, the possibility of social transformation. It is here Walton argues that those who are marginalized because of their race or gender, quote, find within this religious phenomenon a place where their humanity is affirmed and on full display. I extend this analysis to include those marginalized by their sexual orientation and or gender identity. It is here I argue in the spaces of liminality created by religious phenomena, like the charismatic worship experience, where queer participants can be validated, legitimated, and authenticated, not by the message coming from the pulpit, which may disclaim their value, but by the move of the spirit they experience in their bodies, implicit claims about the standing of the soul and the body vis-a-vis the divine that can counter the negative messages about sexuality and counter from the pulpit or elsewhere, or in this context, the performative silence. As such, I argue, participation by queer people in the charismatic worship experience is a form of agency, and even religious activism, because it requires the participant to surrender a measure of bodily and mental control over to the experience in order to realize these affirming potentials, but also because it demands a participant to suspend the performance of certain Western colonial constructs like rationality and respectability. This form of agency is on full display at the AIDS benefit, observable in the way the Love Center Choir cultivates and enacts joy in each performance, and in the way the Love Center Choir displayed a form of agency and religious activism in the way the choir both participated in and invited the audience to participate in the rhetorical performance of faith in the face of an otherwise hopeless situation. Indeed, there's a certain irony in the choir centering its performance around the theme of Jesus making a way. What does it mean to say to someone dying of AIDS that Jesus will make a way? What does this way look like and where does it lead? Is the best and most that one can hope for the relief of death? And how did it compound the emotional turmoil for Black gays and lesbians to be contending with the HIV/AIDS crisis, while also dealing with rejection and alienation from the people, networks, and institutions that traditionally provided their spiritual and emotional support? These tensions are perhaps most starkly dramatized in the choir's second to last performance, Is There Any Way That I Can Make It?, the only downbeat song in the evening set. In this number, the female lead wrestles with the weight of her trial, finding in her faith blessed assurance, but nonetheless grappling with her moment of God-forsakenness. And here we have the lyrics. She sings, "Is there any way that I can make it? Seems I've got so far to go. Though it may not be easy, I have this assurance that you promised always to see me through. Every turn a new beginning, something never dealt with before. There I am in the midst of the storm, and I cry, Lord, I just want to die, Lord. Then I fall, Lord, right back in your loving arms." I imagine this lamentation would have resonated that night at the benefit, reflecting the moanings and longings and pain of a people accustomed to sickness and death, wrestling with their own moments of God-forsakenness. And yet Reverend Hawkins and Love Center Choir's immediate response is a simple assurance God will take care of you, the performance that began this presentation. Alicia Lola Jones notes a long history within gospel music of songs of faith making allusions to incurable illness and healing, including allusions to HIV. But viewing these discourses through the theoretical lenses described above, I argue, renders visible something more. It helps us see in this moment the narrative and discursive strategies Black, gay, and lesbians used to rhetorically construct themselves and the world around them in this moment of God-forsakenness, through messages of hope repeated and reiterated, through exhortation, singing, and participatory praise and worship. I argue that this is a form of agency and religious activism because it enables survival and flourishing in a community's moment of need. It is instrumental for forming communities and kinship networks that can nourish and sustain people in times of struggle, in some cases even laying the groundwork or enabling more recognizable forms of public service and political action. This form of agency is not only powerful in and of itself, but even prompts us to reconsider or to queer the dominant paradigms of the gay and lesbian political imaginary. It challenges us to reassess the role and significance of Black religious communities, ambiguous affirmations of or ambiguous responses to queerness, and to locate within this ambiguity the potential for queer freedom, liberation, or at the very least, survival and flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you very much. Our next paper will be presented by Vincent Lui. Vincent is a student in the Master of Theological Studies program at Loyola University, Maryland, with particular interest in Christian liberation theology and public policy. Before Loyola, Vincent received a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Maryland, College Park, specializing in social policy, focused on community development and nonprofit management and leadership, as well as a BA in social welfare from the University of California, Berkeley. At Loyola, Vincent aims to apply a Christian theological perspective to questions that have arisen from his professional experiences in the government and nonprofit sectors. Today, Vincent will be offering a presentation on his paper entitled Activism, Intractable Homicide Rates, Christian Churches, and Imagining the Common Good, Insights from Liberation Theology. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. Before I start, I'm wondering if I could also share screen as I put together a few slides. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to test out some ideas here. The paper, the presentation of it will necessarily be streamlined, and hopefully it will be more coherent. When I read the call for papers, I asked myself, does the schema of activism leading to political change still apply? Let me explain. Despite Black Lives Matter protests over Freddie Gray and George Floyd, Baltimore, Maryland has largely failed to make Black Lives Matter in the lower case, as Baltimore has seen over 300 murders per year for the last 7 years. Granted, crime has increased across the nation during the COVID-19 pandemic, but there is a broad pattern in Baltimore City. The unresponsiveness of societal institutions is vexing because Maryland is one of the wealthiest states in the US. Inequity is obviously part of the problem, including the politics that maintain it. However, for the sake of brevity, political analysis of Maryland and Baltimore will be footnoted. Baltimore is also home to myriad non-governmental institutions, including nonprofit organizations and religious groups that purportedly aim to help the marginalized. Suffice it to say, the funders of the nonprofit sector, some with assets in the millions and billions of dollars, are not lacking resources. For context, the question of this paper arose from my experiences in several churches within the White L of Baltimore City, which continued their usual charitable and philanthropic activities despite the heightened violence while praying for peace. Picture a white L shape in the middle of a black butterfly shape. That is how Dr. Lawrence Brown describes the segregated geography of Baltimore City. The white L is the mostly north-south center of Baltimore City, whose population is predominantly white and much wealthier than the surrounding neighborhoods. To acknowledge my own situatedness in this discussion, I am neither white nor black nor wealthy, but I bring my perspective as a son of lower middle-class Asian immigrants, as a Christian, one who has attended churches in the white L of Baltimore, but who lives in the black butterfly, and as a graduate student whose school is in the white L. I speak from my own perspective and do not intend to overgeneralize or question, for example, the efforts of Black churches in Baltimore. But what might explain the unresponsiveness of some churches in the white L? Is it an inability to consider those in the black butterfly as neighbors we are to love? The question of this paper is, for those who seek the common good by faith in a just and loving God, what is the moral responsibility of Christians when activists protest the failure of societal institutions to address social injustice? Underlying the question is the assumption, how can politics change if we the people, in church of all places, do not change? To put the bottom line up front, the responsibility of Christians is to reflect, seek correctives to our theology, listen to the community, and empower each other to do both more and do differently. To answer the question, I will examine the failures and limitations of the public and private sectors, especially the devolution of government functions and what is called the nonprofit industrial complex. Afterward, I will analyze the problems using the liberation theology of Gustavo Gutierrez and Willie Jennings, and argue that Christian churches, by nature public institutions with a vision of the common good exemplified in the religious practice of communion, should develop and implement methods for analyzing and responding to political activism to work around the unresponsiveness of societal institutions. Here, I'll share a couple of slides real quick to show what I'm talking about. Here's a graph put together of the number of homicides from 2007 to 2021, and see that spike in 2015 after Freddie Gray incident. And it's continued to be high. And that's why that's part of the driving question is it's been high. What's not happening that can drive it down? And that makes sense. And just to show the black butterfly here, here's the map of the homicides in Baltimore City. You see that they're spread out, and Dr. Lawrence Brown calls this like a butterfly shape. And there's this kind of blank space right in the middle, and it's kind of an L shape. And that's where I am. That's my reference point. And these are homicides 2015, and then the previous map from 2014. It's less dense, but it's the same shape. And just to put in the maps of racial ethnic distribution and also poverty, right? Again, you see that L shape. Here it's pink for the ethnicity, and then also the poverty rate, same shape. So I wanted to show that here. I can stop sharing that. So continuing on with the paper, trying to find an explanation for the unresponsiveness. And from the perspective of public policy, potential explanations for the failures of the institutions and limitations of the institutions include the devolution or transfer of governmental functions to the private sector, for example, via grants and contracting, and the rise of the nonprofit, quote unquote, nonprofit industrial complex, or NPIC. Jennifer Samimi draws a connection between the two in her article, Funding America's Nonprofits, the Nonprofit Industrial Complex's Hold on Social Justice. According to the group Insight, the NPIC is comprised by the government, the owning classes, foundations, and social service organizations, and social justice organizations. To explain briefly, funding bodies such as the government and foundations exert power over community leaders such that the NPIC is able to provide things such as emergency food and other short-term services, which has undoubtedly been crucial during the economic downturn due to the COVID pandemic. but it is not good at structural change despite activism. It is a frustration that I have heard from activists on various occasions. To acknowledge the failures and limitations of some churches in the White L of Baltimore, but not to belabor the point, suffice it to say that some of the philanthropic and charitable practices of churches in the White L, from my experiences, fall into the pattern of the NPIC despite their apparent autonomy. This alludes to the underlying politics of the NPIC. Arguably, the NPIC is not only a set of institutional relationships, but a political ideology. The ideology that gave rise to the NPIC likely operates in the minds of some Christians today. The ideology may be a part of what the theologian Willie Jennings calls, quote, a diseased social imagination, unquote, stemming from colonialism and racism that makes, quote, the Christian life collectively anemic, end quote. Liberation theology offers some insight on how to analyze the situation from a different angle. For the people who find themselves at risk of deadly violence, liberation might well mean the difference between life and death. To directly state what was implied in the paper, one responsibility of Christians is to reflect on what they are doing and what they believe. As stated by Gustavo Gutierrez, one of the founders of liberation theology, Latin American liberation theology, is that the task of liberation theology is, quote, critical reflection on Christian praxis in light of the Word of God, unquote. If salvation is found in Jesus Christ, as Christians believe, then, quote, what relation is there between salvation and the historical process of human liberation, unquote? This is the question of liberation theology, as Gutierrez puts it. Citing St. Paul, he writes, for freedom, Christ has set us free, Galatians 5. St. Paul refers here to liberation from sin insofar as it represents a selfish turning in upon oneself. To sin is to refuse to love one's neighbor and therefore the Lord himself. But St. Paul asserts not only that Christ liberated us, he also tells us that he did it in order that we might be free. Free for what? Free to love. Thus, to love is the telos of liberation from sin. And from the perspective of Gutierrez's theology, quote, only liberation from sin gets to the very source of social injustice and other forms of human oppression and reconciles us with God and our fellow human beings, unquote. Furthermore, writes Gutierrez, quote, the fullness of liberation, a free gift from Christ, is communion with God and with other human beings, unquote. To speak of the fullness of liberation would mean comprehensively addressing sin, which Gutierrez does in the concept of integral liberation. Beside the theologian Daniel Castillo, liberation is integral in that, according to Gutierrez, according to Gutierrez, liberation is realized at three distinct yet reciprocally interpenetrating levels or dimensions of human life, unquote. The first level is the socio-structural, which includes the economic and political. Second, the cultural/psychological, for example, racism. And third, the theological. An important point here is that while the theological dimension can be seen as encompassing the socio-structural and cultural/psychological dimensions, as well as underlying both, the theological level also requires correction at times, and correctives from outside of theology and within it should be utilized. The church, communion, and imagining the common good. Thus, another responsibility of Christians is to seek correctives to their theological understanding. Perhaps one way to do so is to reimagine the common good by reflecting upon communion in light of the public nature of the church. When Gutierrez discussed communion above, he surely is not referring to the sacrament of communion, also known as the Eucharist or Lord's Supper, by bringing in the sacrament to illustrate the following options. To highlight an aside from the paper, one option is the very first Lord's Supper. As Matthew 26 shows, after the supper, the disciples start falling asleep. One betrays Jesus for money. One disowns him, and they all desert him and go their separate ways. Some churches may echo this episode, broadly speaking, and they allow social injustice to continue unchallenged. On the other hand, briefly consider the Great Commission Jesus' charge to his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations in Matthew 28. The charge to go to all people or be open to all people makes the church a public institution. Compare it with the basic definition of a public good. Now factor in the sacrament of communion. The Great Commission, in effect, calls for an ever-expanding communion, but the sacrament is a representation of how the people of God should live in liberation from sin. Recall the discussion above on communion and integral liberation. That is an ever more inclusive common good. To quote from a song lyric from Casting Crowns, what if the church on Sunday was still the church on Monday too? What if the common good envisioned during communion was the common good being built on Monday too? And let the inclusion start with the poor and suffering. I would be remiss if I did not at least mention a key component of Gutierrez's liberation theology, the preferential option for the poor. Very briefly, the preferential option is ultimately theocentric, he writes. Quote, an option for the poor is an option for the God of the kingdom, whom Jesus proclaims to us, as the entire Bible mirrors God's predilection for the weak and abused of human history, end quote. Due to time constraints, I can only sketch what I think are additional responsibilities of Christians and churches as I close. The following is based on Jennings' theological commentary on the book of Acts. This would be a corrective from within theology. The first is to reflect on whether we are more like Saul or St. Paul. That is, are we too comfortable within our religiosity as deadly violence surrounds us? Again, remember the white L as what my reference point, and the violence is all around. Saul, of course, is directly converted by God's self, but here arises another conundrum. If God's self does not correct the Sauls directly, then how might the Sauls know that they ought to seek out correctives? Now I will switch analogies and draw upon an earlier part of Acts, as it provides an example of how church leaders can listen to the people in their congregations in order to do social justice. The example is found in Acts 6, 1-7. The point to take away from the example is not about food distribution, but about caring for the most vulnerable in the community. In the example, the church leaders actually had the ability to listen to those in the community who complained. Then they responded by electing new leaders to address complaints. That is, they were able to respond to a new problem in addition to continuing their usual practices. Churches need leaders who can listen and others who can be elected to address community needs. Church leaders should be on the lookout for people in their congregations with such potential. People who, for example, have the prophetic gift for speaking out about social injustice. However, such a prophetic leader would still be in the circle of the church. There is another level of listening that needs to be done. The leader needs a way of connecting to the community. Therefore, I argue that Christian churches should develop and implement methods for analyzing and responding to political activism. If political institutions and nonprofit organizations cannot respond to activists' demands, Christians should seek ways to fulfill their responsibility to love their neighbors who are suffering by working with activists. In the language of liberation theology, the activists would, in effect, be providing a corrective to the diseased social imagination from outside of the theological level. In sum, when activists protest the failure of societal institutions to address social injustice, the moral responsibility of those Christians who seek the common good by faith in the just and loving God is to listen to the voice of the suffering, for example, of activists, and seek ways to respond that are in addition to what they are doing. An interesting example to consider is the work of the Center in Baltimore. As a note, I do not work for them. But as a less traditional nonprofit founded in 2011 by the Presbytery of Baltimore, the Center's work is to educate churches by connecting them with activists to learn community organizing skills for anti-racist work, going beyond the church's usual charity or philanthropy model. This would be a way for churches to work around the NPIC. After listening to activists, churches should respond to the issues as directly as possible whenever they can, within the law and other reasonable bounds, challenging public policy when necessary. Such a process would in fact be the process of integral liberation. Christians would be liberated from some of their poor theology, and people in our communities would be liberated from situations of deadly violence. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And thanks again to Danny. I'll now turn it over to Dr. McKanan for his response.
Well, thank you both so much for these really engaging and important papers. And thank you to Zach and the other conference organizers for bringing us together and giving us the chance for what will be another 40 minutes of dialogue here, I think. What unifies these two papers is their strong emphasis on the role of congregations in responding to the justice challenges present in the larger society. Danny Ballon-Garst takes a deep dive into the life of just one congregation, while Vincent Lui looks across the city of Baltimore to think about how congregations could be more effective. Now, the study of congregations has often been somewhat neglected, even within the fields of social ethics and practical theology. We're easily tempted to oscillate between a focus on exemplary individuals at one end and a wide-ranging concern for movements, denominations, and nations at the other end. But the congregation is always the place of intersection between the individual and the movement. And as such, it needs more of our analysis and theoretical attention. So what I'm going to try to do in my comments is to lift up the theories of congregations that each of you are developing in your papers and invite you to be in dialogue with one another about those theories. I'll start with Danny. If I read your paper correctly, your central proposal is that even imperfect congregations can be centers of life-giving activism when they affirm the multiple dimensions of their members' identity and agency. You focus on Oakland's Love Center, which was perhaps the most queer-affirming majority Black congregation in the Bay Area during the AIDS crisis. Actually, I wasn't quite clear if it was the most queer-affirming majority Black congregation or not. So you might clarify that point. You acknowledge that Love Center's response to AIDS may seem inadequate if measured by the confrontational standards of ACT UP. Though it held this high-profile AIDS benefit concert, it didn't celebrate same-sex marriages or even encourage its own queer leaders to be fully open about their identities. Yet Love Center did several things that could not happen in ACT UP or other predominantly white gay activist spaces. It encouraged people to bring both their Black and their queer identities to the same table, rather than having to choose between them. It modeled ethical action within structures of constraint, rather than suggesting that the only ethical actors are those who come out so completely that they've broken free of all societal norms. And perhaps most importantly, it did this in a specifically religious way by leaning heavily on the embodied practices of Black Pentecostalism. Queer people could be validated, legitimated, and authenticated by experiencing the movement of the Spirit in their bodies, something that might not have been possible within liberation movements that were more fully embedded in the intellectual and intellectualist heritage of the Enlightenment. That's an essential point, and it's one that you draw largely from the ethnographic work of Saba Mahmood, who makes a similar claim about agency among pious Muslim women in Egypt. However, it seems to me that there's a crucial difference between your case study and Mahmood's. I tried to put this in a sophisticated way and I couldn't figure it out, so I'm just going to put it in a crass way. I think the leaders of Love Center knew what they were doing to a much greater extent than Mahmood's pious women. If you were to describe Mahmood's argument to the pious women, they would probably resist, insisting that they weren't trying to foster women's agency, but simply trying to help them submit more fully to Allah. But if you were to describe your argument to Yvette Flunder or Walter Hawkins, my hunch is that they would say, yes, we were trying to provide queer Black people with a sense of somebodyness. And yes, we knew we couldn't do that fully unless we stayed grounded in our Pentecostal heritage. Now, I realize this is a somewhat speculative claim, but in any event, I hope that in your future research, you are in active dialogue with Yvette Flunder and others from Love Center. I know that Walter Hawkins is no longer among us. To be full dialogue partners with you as you develop the idea of what exactly their niche was in the justice movement they were relating to. I meant to say earlier that I really appreciated your inclusion of the video in your presentation today. That gave a dimension that I didn't have when I was just reading the paper. And it brought up another question for me. I said before that activist groups like ACT UP are in the heritage of the intellectual heritage of the Enlightenment. And a small voice in my head when I said that was saying, no, that's not quite right. Because of course, all forms of queer liberation are embodied in a way that classic Enlightenment liberalism is not. But when I thought about watching that video, watching the people in the audience, who seem to be a mix of regular Love Center members and perhaps others from the broader queer community, is that queer embodiment was changing in a very difficult way during the AIDS crisis. Prior to the AIDS crisis, sexual liberation, the free expression of sexuality, was integral to at least gay male culture in San Francisco. And in the face of a deadly disease, many gay men were changing their sexual behavior and thus changing an embodied practice that was central to their identity. And so I wonder, especially for those who may not have been from a specifically Pentecostal background, if the embodiment of Pentecostalism was playing some kind of facilitating role as men changed the way they embodied their identity. Okay, so the challenge that I see your paper bringing to Vincent's paper is precisely your emphasis on the religious and specifically Pentecostal dimension of Love Center's activism. You challenge Vincent to think about what congregations can do that no other organizations can, simply because of that religious dimension. Now I'm going to turn to Vincent. You invite congregations, especially, but not only in the city of Baltimore, to embrace a more integral approach to liberation, drawn on insights from Gustavo Gutierrez and Willie Jennings. And you suggest, somewhat provocatively, that this can only happen if congregations stop acting as part of the Nonviolent Industrial Conference. I'm grateful to you for this phrase. I had not heard it before, but as I understand it from your presentation, the charities that make up the Nonprofit Industrial Conference perform many of the functions that were performed by government before the austerity policies that began in the 1980s. They steer clear of addressing the structural factors that lead to violence, because to do so might put them at risk of losing their nonprofit status or incurring the disfavor of the foundations and governmental bodies on which they rely for funding. In focusing on the Nonprofit Industrial Conference, you seem to be pointing your critical analysis primarily at those congregations that engage their communities in similar ways. Congregations, for example, that run food pantries or homeless shelters or soup kitchens. And in the latter part of your presentation, you seem to be suggesting that what these churches should do instead is work closely with community-based activists who are deeply embedded in the neighborhoods suffering from the violence. Congregations could provide these activists with funding that is not available from foundations, with pro bono professional services, and with other forms of allyship. I broadly agree with this proposal. I would note that it is very closely related to Gustavo Gutierrez's critique of so-called developmentalism and his insistence that true liberation is qualitatively different from attempts to move poor countries along a westernizing path to development. So the phrase nonprofit industrial complex plays the same role in your paper that the word developmentalism does in Gutierrez's work. But your proposal also took me by surprise because your opening paragraph led me to expect something different. You began by describing the seemingly intractable problem of deadly violence in Baltimore, and then suggesting that it's doubtful that activism can lead to the sort of political change that would make things better. Reading that, I thought you were offering a critical challenge to a different set of congregations that have already moved beyond conventional charity and align themselves fully with Black Lives Matter movement or with community organizations inspired by Saul Alinsky. And I was eager to see how you were going to flesh out that critique of activism, because the truth is that there are a lot of activist congregations like that, and they haven't yet managed to put an end to murder on the streets of Baltimore. Indeed, as we saw in the recent New York mayoral race, there are plenty of poor Black and brown voters who don't trust either the police or police abolitionists to keep them safe from violence. To be clear, I do support the goals of the police abolition movement, but I don't believe that movement has yet fully made its case to the people most directly impacted by violence about what their alternative is. So I can't help but think there might be a space here for the specifically religious mode of activism that Danny observed at Love Center. So that's my first question for you. Is your proposal simply that congregations should pivot from charity to activism in solidarity with grassroots movements? Or is it rather that they have some distinctive work to do that cannot be reduced either to charity or to activism? Relatedly, I'm also curious about the role of congregations that exist in the Black Butterfly. You were very appropriately restrained in your approach to speak out of your own context as a member of a white L congregation. But I think there are some things you could move further on in thinking about how white L congregations can learn directly not only from the activism, but also from the religious practice of the congregations in the Butterfly. I was also quite taken by your observation that churches are private by law, but public by nature. This strikes me as exactly right, and I would add in partial defense of the American founding fathers that when they made the churches private, their goal was probably not to constrain the justice-seeking activities of churches in the public sphere, but rather to put an end to the manifold ways in which the state-sponsored churches of their era were exercising special privileges at the expense of the common good. But in our own era, I wonder, are you suggesting that churches ought to voluntarily relinquish their tax-exempt status in order to be more fully public in their actions? If not, why not? And if so, what are the most important things you'd hope these newly liberated churches would begin to do? Finally, I think the most important challenge you bring to Danny is the idea of the nonprofit industrial complex, which has the potential, I think, to add a new dimension to Danny's analysis of the ambiguity of activism at places like Love Center. Okay, so to start the conversation between the two of you, I'll just reduce my comments to one question for each of you. For Danny, is or was Love Center part of the nonprofit industrial complex? And how might its ministry have been different if it were not? And for Vincent, how would you characterize the modes of agency that are fostered in your own congregation and in the work of the Center at Baltimore? How do those modes of agency differ, if they differ at all, from the charismatic agency found at Love Center? So Danny, I'll let you go first.
Thank you, Professor McKanan. That is a great question. And I really appreciate, got all these thoughtful responses. I'm going to have to spend some time with this, thinking about it. I mean, I guess, so to answer one of the questions you raised in your responses about, was Love Center, I think you asked, was it the only majority Black queer affirming church in the area? I don't think that was the case. I think there were also, I don't think there were any majority Black MCC churches, but by this point, Carl Bean had already started the Unity Fellowship Church movement. So there were Unity churches, I think, in the region as well. What Love Center was that was different was it was the only majority Black Pentecostal charismatic church. I think, and so that would have separated Love Center from MCC, from the Unity Fellowship churches. And so in some ways, for the purposes of this presentation, I kind of set up the foil as the comparison between the ACT UP protest and the concert. But in the original paper this came from, the seminar paper, the foil was not so much as ACT UP protest, but the MCC and Unity churches. And Love Center was kind of an alternative to those. Yeah, I think this question about, I love the comparison, the way you put what I'm doing here in conversation with Saba Mahmoud's work, because I'm drawing on her, but I think you're absolutely right in the sense that, that Reverend Hawkins and Bishop Flunder would probably say, yes, that they were consciously not just like navigating and working within this ambiguous space, but almost strategically leveraging it, right? Like I always have to remind myself that Reverend Hawkins was a household name. The Hawkins family, this was a household name in many Black homes, right? Black religious homes, because their music was so popular. And so they were reaching millions and millions of people. And so there was a way in which they were both able to reach more people by navigating this ambiguous space that they would have been cut off from had they been more liberationist, more adamant, more open about things. And so I think there is definitely some strategic navigating and leveraging of that. So to get to your question though about, was Love Center part of the nonprofit industrial complex? I mean, I think that is in this specific paper, that is kind of one of the things I'm wrestling with, right? Is this theoretical question about how to position queer religious subjects as we look back at them in a historical perspective. So my research kind of broadly focuses on, LGBTQ religious history with a focus especially on Black and Latino, Pentecostals, evangelicals, fundamentalists. And it's sometimes kind of hard to know what to do with what they're doing and how to interpret the moves that they're making theologically and in terms of their political practice and religious practice. And so this question that you teed up, I think is so perfectly kind of gets that tension, because certainly, so I could say a little more about what Love Center was doing kind of shortly after this concert. Shortly after the concert, the church opened, what would the word be? It would be, I think it was like a homeless shelter for people with AIDS. And there's this one newspaper article where they interview one of the people there who was gay, but he says, I loved being here. They just accepted me as I was, and they never asked me anything about my sexuality. Like that, the point was like, they didn't want to know, they didn't ask. So Love Center, was opening these homeless shelters, was very involved in kind of social ministry to people with AIDS. Which in its moment, right, in 1989, was a big deal. It was one of the only Black churches that was doing, one of a handful of Black churches that was doing this. Was one of a handful of minority serving providers in the region. I think there's this whole history of organizations that were run by Black and Latino people in San Francisco and Los Angeles that were really just struggling to stay afloat, and that were really kind of the primary alternative source of care to the AIDS service providers in kind of the white gay neighborhoods. And so they were playing this very important role in their moment. And so in that moment, I don't think that they were, but certainly if you were to kind of move them over into our day today, we probably would say that they were, right? And so even kind of this framework of, I invoked Jonathan Walton's competing rituals of self-affirmation, social accommodation. I talked about the affirmation part, but I didn't talk about the accommodation part. Ultimately, Walton, like Turner, did not think that these rituals of self-affirmation were necessarily a good thing, because they thought that while there was this liberatory moment in the liminal moment of a religious phenomenon, that ultimately it became a mode of social accommodation, in Walton's case, to like capitalism and to neoliberalism. And so, so if we transpose Love Center to today, I think it clearly registers in that way. It kind of clearly registers almost in this apparatus of being a salve to some forms of social harms, but then ultimately kind of keeping people from doing the type of activism and the kind of direct political challenge that would subvert the system and kind of lead to lasting change. So that's kind of my answer. Maybe it's a little slippery kind of way to get at it, right? In its moment, I don't think it was. I think what they were doing in their moment was quite unique and quite important. But it might register different if it was something that was happening today. And I think for me as a historian who's kind of informed by cultural anthropology, it's trying to come up with a theoretical framework for doing history that kind of can allow for that and account for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Vincent, you want to talk a little bit about modes of agency at your congregation, the center, and in relation to Danny's analysis?
Sure thing. And just interesting note, I'm actually from San Francisco. So Castro District, and the kind of, I guess the spirit of activism there is something that obviously I was formed by. But anyways, yeah, I think building on what Danny said, there's trying to think how to phrase it. At a certain moment in history or in a situation, where call for different modes of agency, and each moment also has different constraints. And so when those constraints offer, I guess, opportunities, either for activism or action or a combination of both, then I think based on what challenge you're trying to meet, you have to take that. So the Love Center, people could say, well, they should have done more activism directly, should call the problem out. But they're also trying to meet the need of caring for people with a health problem. Like, it's not just that, there's identity, there's obviously political issues and social issues there. But at that moment, they prioritized, we want to get awareness on how do we care for people who are dying. And so they said, well, we'll kind of do this thing, this charitable event, or this, and it was also activism, but it was just limited to that. And like Danny said, it could be pre-activism, could have started a lot more, and they did take action afterward. Right now, I think that bringing it back to Baltimore, and in our era of what we can call the nonprofit industrial complex, it's kind of solidified into its own thing, where it's like, okay, we want to balance meeting needs. And COVID also brings an interesting dimension to it, because we're kind of back to that. Like, people actually have immediate needs for food and other services, but they don't really quite get at that structural problem, where how do we bring people out of poverty, or in these neighborhoods that, if you say, well, we want to help kids, but they go back to these neighborhoods where they walk through the streets and they could be victims of violence. It doesn't necessarily change that. And it's been 7 years, and it's like, okay, are we still stuck in this mode where, okay, all we can do is meet the immediate needs? And so it raises a broader question, because as the period extends, the question, it becomes deeper, I think. It's not just, okay, it's like, have we had enough time to think about it and respond as a society, as congregations? And if we keep saying, no, we need more time, that it's that perplexing aspect of it. Like, no, it's not a new situation anymore, but we're still using old modes of thinking about it. I don't know if that makes sense. Or So that's kind of what it feels like, but the center is interesting too. So kind of I was in previous, what I previously just said was kind of relating to the mode at my church or the churches that I've been experiencing, but the center, it's trying to kind of break the congregations out of that. But to me, the intersection is churches have a unique opportunity to do both, and both of those practices can inform each other. Whereas, because especially in the YL, they have both the resources and supposedly the acumen to navigate the political forces and kind of develop a more sophisticated response. But if you're talking just activism, Black Lives Matter, it's a broad statement, people march, and then so that's the activism piece. And then you have the piece of meeting direct needs. But when you bring the intersection together, that's some kind of lived out statement of these are the needs that are there. Like we're not just protesting and saying the government needs help. We're actually starting to help them and break free of the complex. That would be a way to, as I see it, kind of break that cycle. Say, okay, now we're part of the game. Now we're starting to kind of be in the community. We ourselves are the community, and we are also the activists. But right now, that's not the position that I see that the churches are in, that I'm part of. So it's sorry for long-windedness, and hopefully it makes sense. I think there's that intersection.
Yeah, one of the things I hear you saying there is that part of the role of the White L churches is to be the bridge between, say, Black Lives Matter and the political and economic power structure of Baltimore. And this is interesting for me, thinking about my own experience in, first in liberal Protestant and then in Unitarian Universalist congregations. I'm not sure we have as many of the political and economic leaders as we did in the middle of the 20th century. What's your read in your congregation and other White L congregations? Are there people in the pews who can push the levers of power if called upon to do so?
In my sense, I don't see that now.
Yeah.
So, and that's another piece of the puzzle, I think, that needs to be addressed. It's like if the people are there, I mean, if we bring a little history into it, we call it, I'm trying to think of the phrase for it, where people moved out of the cities, right?
Yeah.
But people, they went to the suburbs during that period after the civil rights movement. And so that kind of political power shifted out and got diffused and spread out, but the churches are still here. And the wealth is in some sense still here.
Yeah.
So there's a disjunction there that I think that rather than just political power, that kind of relying on the past political power of the individuals who might have left, we have to think about what is, like, in terms of our role with if you think about the resources and the responsibility come with their resources, and also that like spatial location of it, right in the middle, still has some power, but the individuals aren't there.
Yeah.
It's another conundrum, I think, but it still raises the question of then was like, if I was my responsibility in that church then,
Right.
like, can I just sit there and be like, okay, we have no political power right now, we have some resources and we're still in the middle, so is there a way to gain that political power?
Right.
And it started by kind of not just falling into the pattern of like the complex. that, yeah.
So I have a few more questions I could ask, but I want to open the floor to Zach or Martin if you have any things you'd like to pose to our presenters. Or Dennis, if you had a chance to read the papers in advance.
I do actually have a couple of things that I think about even in my own research is questions of viability. And one of the things I was thinking about with the Love Center was like the distinction between what you would hear from the pulpit or the ambo and what you might hear in a pastor's office. And the distinctions that can be drawn there that I think are sort of important boundaries that are drawn between internal and external forums, so that we have at least, let's put it this, at least I swirl in Roman Catholic circles, and so as a result, what often happens is we have this sort of ideals that exist in the public, and then we have these things that happen in the pastor's office that are a bit more pastoral, that we accompany people who aren't, able to strive toward the ideal necessarily, whether it's on contraceptions or something like that. It's sort of low-hanging fruit again. But I wonder, there are certain times when that distinction is necessitated by society, and then there are other times when that's just sort of chosen. And I think sometimes the chosen portion, and I think also some of the necessity side is a question of viability, and whether if we begin to sort of traipse into certain issues, whatever those issues might be, we begin to risk our own community's existence as it, folks will begin to leave, people will walk, and I think in some sense, churches, generally speaking, as the rise of the nuns and all of that sort of results in an overwhelming concern with viability. And I think that, I'm thinking now this pivot point to the white L as well, right? That those communities are sort of, I'm speculating a bit, but those are historical churches that have been around for a long time. And even if that white L, they become destination churches, destination parishes for folks who might live in the suburbs now and they come into town for church or whatever. And I'm just wondering, is there a space to rethink the way congregations consider themselves as, at least in the Christian context, concerning themselves more with the paschal mystery and recognizing that death is a part of this, and that we need to sort of lean into the sort of the kenotic, the willingness to give it all up in hopes that there is a certain form of institutional resurrection, or is that a risk that begins to sort of in the Love Center space that we lose a capacity to do something good in the position that we have, even if we're not able to say it all. That also is a bit long-winded, but I hope the themes, you could respond to some of those themes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think I have two responses to that, right? To start with the kind of part of the last part of the question first, which is like, is there space to do the good, or kind of is there, thinking about viability, is there a way of doing church, and there are certain ways of not doing it that would kind of subvert the ability to do the good. And I think one question is like, what is the good that we're concerned with, right? And I think this is in conversation, I think, very much with Vincent's point about if the good is is asserting a direct challenge to societal injustices and structures of injustice, right? Then it's kind of going to be one answer. But I think some of the comments that came through and Professor McKanan's comments, right, is there a good that is happening in these congregations that are imperfect, that is a good of its own right? Is there some form of life that's being flourished and cultivated that may not register kind of in a political register, but that still has some value and some importance, right? And we do that. And I think for me, what I'm really trying to think about is there, as especially as academics and people who study religion academically, is there a way we tell the story about what's happening in these congregations? And is there a way we tell the stories about what's happening in these movements that either creates space for that to happen, for that complexity to be there, or maybe is there ways that we tell this story that curtails the ability for that complexity to exist? Like, is there a way that we reify a particular narrative that almost kind of necessitates this kind of polarity in congregational life? That I think it sounds like you want, or you're concerned with, or at least trying to avoid.
Very, very interesting. I was just thinking back to what Dr. McKanan was asking, and I think kind of right off the bat, it's attractive to think, oh yeah, let's just do it. Let's do the sacrificial method, the kenotic method. We have to do what is right. But I think that issue of effectiveness is still there, then the viability. Like, if you do that, will actually help the people who are in need. And I think that when I was thinking about the nonprofit industrial complex, I was thinking, how do we use the frameworks of that charity model, but do it intensely enough, or in a kind of a slightly different mode that brings the people who are being helped actually out of their situation rather than keeping them there.
Hmm.
Kind of intensifying what we're already doing. And so it fits within that mode of, this is our theology, this is how we are currently doing work. How to do it more and more intensely so that it's viable in achieving that goal to get the people out of the situation. And activism could help with that. We could make a statement that, oh, we really need to denounce violence and help people but then after that, what can we do? I think there needs to be a balance between the activism and making statements, and then balancing that with the effective goals, but not minimizing that goal to just what is conceived in the complex. Like this, not kind of limiting ourselves just to that. But it's not, yeah, it's not that simple, I think. I don't know. It's definitely complicated.
So Vincent, if you were to move one structural lever that you think would change the rate of homicide in Baltimore, what would it be?
At the church or in policy, or
At the policy level?
Mm-hmm. I mean, ideally, like when I think of the spatial, like those maps that I showed,
Yeah.
right? Usually two broad ways of thinking about it is, one, redevelop those areas of that are suffering from violence and kind of clean it up, so to speak. Like, we need to reinvigorate the police or whatnot to enforce the laws and put people away or something like that, prosecute crime. I think that model has been facing struggles now. There's gentrification, there's problems with law enforcement and all that. I think the other way to think about it is, there are people there that, when you think about segregation, do the flip side of it, right? How do we bring people out into areas of opportunity that give them a chance out of that area, that region, that neighborhood, that kind of puts them at risk? Those are programs that have been tried before. I know HUD has had programs for relocation back in the 90s, things like that. So that's also been tried. But I think the question I have whenever the complex work or the kind of food pantry, like charity work happens, is what happens after that? What happens to the family after that? What happened to those kids? And those are I think that would be a question that could facilitate decreasing the violence. Like, if we go down a level, like dig a little more, what's motivating the violence and what needs to be provided to the people to not commit the violence anymore, or to be victims of the violence.
Yeah.
I think that's the level that really is been on my mind. Yeah, I don't know if it's a single lever or not, but that's that question right there. What's happening to that family or those people at the end of the day after they receive XYZ services?
No. Zach, are we needing to pivot to get ready for the closing?
We have about 4 minutes, but I don't want to belabor the point. It's a pretty quick turnaround, so maybe you'll want to break before the concluding remarks. So why don't we, unless there are any pressing comments or questions, I will we'll call it here. Thank again Vincent and Danny for their presentations and Dr. McKanan for his response. And we'll see you here in about 10-ish minutes, 8-ish minutes for the concluding remarks and the announcement of the award. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you both. It's been wonderful to be with you.
Thank you, Dr.